To understand the terrifying possibility that you are biologically incapable of experiencing your own death, we must first look at a machine designed specifically to kill you. This is not a weapon of war or a tool of malice, but a clinical, mathematical apparatus known as the quantum gun. It is a thought experiment that takes the abstract weirdness of subatomic particles and drags it into the brutal reality of human mortality. In the world of into infinite copies, the architecture of the experiment. Imagine a small, soundproof room. Inside this room is a high-speed gun pointed directly at an observer. The gun is not operated by a human finger, but by a quantum trigger, a device hooked up to a machine that measures the spin of a single subatomic particle, such as an electron or a Higgs boson. In quantum mechanics, particles possess a property called spin, which can be measured as being either up or down. This trigger is programmed with a simple, lethal logic. If the measurement device detects the spin as up, the gun fires, and the observer is killed instantly, deleted in a microsecond before their brain can even process the sound of the shot. If the measurement device detects the spin as down, the gun merely emits a hollow click. The observer survives. According to the laws of probability, the observer has exactly a 50% chance of survival. In a classical universe, this is a coin flip with the highest possible stakes. You pull the trigger once, you either live or you die. You pull it 10 times, and the odds of survival drop to less than 1 in 1,000. But we do not live in a classical universe. We live in a quantum one. And in the quantum world, there is no such thing as a single outcome. The wave function and the many worlds. To grasp why this gun might never actually kill you, we must look at the wave function. In the quantum realm, a particle doesn't exist in one state or another until it is measured. Instead, it exists as a cloud of probability, a state called superposition, where it is both up and down at the same time. When the machine measurements the particle to decide whether to fire the gun, it doesn't just choose one outcome. According to the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics, the act of measurement causes the entire universe to split. Reality fractures into 2 distinct branches or bubbles of existence. In one branch, the measurement is up. The gun fires. In the other branch, the measurement is down. The gun clicks. Both branches are equally real. In the first world, your friends and family mourn a tragic accident. In the second world, you breathe a sigh of relief, heart pounding against your ribs, wondering how you got so lucky. The binary of consciousness. This is where the theory of quantum suicide takes a turn into the existential. While the universe may have split into 2 copies, your consciousness cannot. Consciousness is a binary state. You're either experiencing something or you are experiencing nothing. But nothingness is, by definition, not an experience. You cannot be in a world where you have been deleted. You cannot perceive the version of reality where the bullet passed through your brain because that version of you no longer possesses the hardware, the neurons, and the electrical signals required to perceive anything at all. Therefore, from your own subjective perspective, the branch where the gun fires is a dead end for your awareness. Your consciousness has no choice but to follow the branch where you survive. You pull the trigger, click. You pull it again, click. You pull it 1,000 times, click, click, click. To an outside observer, you have performed a miracle. They see you survive odds that are mathematically impossible. But to you, it was never a gamble. You are simply an inhabitant of the only timeline where you are still alive to witness it. You are stuck on the ledge of existence. The invisible executioner. There is a haunting similarity between the quantum gun and the vacuum decay paradox we explored previously. Both involve a silent executioner, a threat that moves so fast and so fundamentally that it bypasses the biological limits of the human mind. In vacuum decay, a spark in the Higgs field creates a bubble of true vacuum that expands at the speed of light. Because it moves at the speed of light, you can never see it coming. The moment the wall of the bubble hits you, your atoms are rewritten and your consciousness is erased in a microsecond. Quantum suicide suggests that if the many worlds theory is true, you will always find yourself in the universe where the bubble never nucleated, or where the gun never fired. You are the beneficiary of a cosmic delay that never ends. The illusion of safety. We navigate our lives with an implicit trust that the sun will rise and that our bodies will continue to function. We assume that safety is the absence of visible threats. But the lesson of the gun and the atom is that our safety is actually a mathematical fluke. We are walking on a frozen lake of probability. We know that underneath the ice is a freezing, crushing depth, the infinite branches of reality, where we have already died in car crashes, from illnesses, or through cosmic accidents. We only feel safe because we are, by definition, the versions of ourselves that haven't fallen through the ice yet. The quantum gun is not just a laboratory experiment. It is a metaphor for every moment of your life. Every second, the Higgs field of your existence is testing the barrier of stability. Every second, the universe is performing a calculation, deciding whether to click or to fire. The trap of immortality. As we move into the next chapters, we will explore the darker side of this impossible stability. If you can never truly experience your own death, it means you're an immortal observer, whether you want to be or not. You are a character in a play performed on a stage that was never meant to be permanent. The false floor of reality might be holding for now, but the quantum gun is always there, hidden in the source code of the vacuum, waiting for the next measurement. Chapter 1 leaves us with a terrifying question. If the gun always clicks for you, but fires for everyone else, what kind of lonely, fractured universe are you eventually going to be left with? We are the witnesses to a false reality, and the true vacuum is waiting just on the other side of the wall. The transition didn't happen with a bang, a flash of light, or a cinematic roar of thunder. It happened with the sound of a tea kettle that refused to stop whistling, even after Elias had turned off the stove. He stood in his kitchen, hand still gripped around the cold plastic handle of the burner dial, staring at the small plume of steam. It defied the laws of thermodynamics, rising steadily, stubbornly, while the high-pitched shriek bored a hole through his skull. Then the sound didn't stop. It divided. One whistle stayed in the kitchen, sharp and metallic. The second whistle, identical in pitch but feeling miles away, echoed from the hallway where no stove existed. Elias stepped back, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. As he moved, the floor beneath his left foot felt like polished oak, the floor he'd installed himself 3 summers ago. But his right foot sank into something cool, damp, and yielding. He looked down. His kitchen floor was no longer a single surface. It was a jagged, shimmering mosaic of 2 different worlds vying for the same coordinates in space. To the left, his apartment remained intact. The spilled coffee grounds on the counter, the stack of unopened mail, the familiar scent of old wood and peppermint. To the right, the linoleum had vanished, replaced by a carpet of bioluminescent moss that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic, violet light. The air itself seemed to have a seam, a vertical line, thin as a spider's silk but glowing with a frantic static energy, ran from the ceiling to the floor, bisecting his kitchen table. "Not again," Elias whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, not today." The architecture of the schism for weeks, the lapses had been minor. A coffee cup that was blue in his hand but red in the mirror. A sunset that lasted for 6 hours. The occasional sight of a person walking backward through time while the rest of the street moved forward. The scientists on the news, the ones still brave enough to broadcast, called it dimensional hemorrhaging. They spoke of the Great Tear as if it were a physical wound in the universe, a byproduct of the failed experiments at the Svalbard Hadron Array. But seeing it on a screen was nothing like standing in the middle of it. Elias reached out a trembling hand toward the seam. As his fingers approached the shimmering line, the air felt thick, like pushing through invisible gelatin. On the other side of the split, he could see his kitchen, but it was wrong. In that version of reality, the walls were painted a deep, bruised crimson instead of eggshell white. The window didn't look out onto the rainy streets of Seattle. It looked out onto an endless expanse of amber desert where 2 suns hung low on the horizon, locked in a gravitational dance. He pulled his hand back. The split wasn't just a visual glitch. It was a fundamental divorce of causality. The weight of 2 lives. The phone on the kitchen counter, the real counter, or at least the one he started the morning in, began to ring. Elias scrambled to answer it, desperate for a tether to something mundane. "Hello?" "Elias, it's Sarah." His breath hitched. Sarah, his wife. Or more accurately, the woman who had been his wife until the first major split 3 years ago. In this reality, they had divorced. In the reality he saw through the crimson-walled kitchen, she had died in a car accident. "Sarah, where are you calling from?" he asked, his eyes darting between the 2 worlds. "I'm at the station," she said, her voice sounding tinny and layered, as if she were speaking through a long pipe. "Elias, the split is widening. The city center is almost entirely overridden by the desert side. They're evacuating the sector for survivors. I need to know. Which side are you on?" Elias looked at the violet moss creeping across his floor. It was beautiful in a terrifying way. Little spores drifted upward, glowing like embers. On the other side of the seam, he saw a version of himself walk into the crimson kitchen. That Elias looked tired, older, wearing a military uniform he didn't recognize. The alternate Elias stopped and stared at the seam, too. For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the dimensional divide. "I don't know," Elias told the phone. "I think I'm standing on the edge." "If you stay on the edge, you'll be torn apart," Sarah warned. "When the realities finally stabilize, and the physicists say they will, anything caught in the overlap will be erased. You have to choose a side of the line, Elias. You have to commit to a world. The impossible choice." Elias dropped the phone. It clattered onto the oak floor, the plastic casing cracking. The split was no longer a thin line. It was a widening maw. The violet moss was growing faster now, swallowing his refrigerator, turning the stainless steel into a trellis for alien vines. The air on the desert side smelled of ozone and toasted cinnamon. It felt warm. A dry, inviting heat that promised a world without the cold, gray drizzle of his current life. But the home side, broken as it was, held his memories. It held the coffee stain Sarah had made the night they decided to separate. It held the stack of mail he was too depressed to open. It was a life of failure, but it was his failure. He looked back at the alternate Elias in the crimson room. The man in the uniform reached out, pressing a palm against the shimmering barrier. He looked desperate. He was mouthing something. Elias leaned in, his ear inches from the static. "Save her," the alternate Elias was saying. "In this world, she's still alive." Elias froze. In the desert side, Sarah was alive? But Sarah had just called him on the phone in the home side. Then it clicked. The Sarah on the phone wasn't his Sarah either. She was a Sarah from a third reality, calling into his world because the lines were tangling like a ball of yarn. There were no two realities. There were infinite, and they were all crashing into the same room. The stabilization. The house began to groan. It wasn't the sound of wood settling. It was the sound of atoms screaming. The seam in the air began to vibrate, a low-frequency hum that vibrated Elias's teeth. The violet moss reached his knees. The amber suns of the desert world were now blindingly bright, pouring heat into his kitchen. He could see the dust motes dancing in the alien light. He had seconds. If he stepped left, he stayed in the world of rain and divorce, where Sarah was a distant voice on a phone. If he stepped right, he entered a world of sand and war, but a world where she might be waiting in the next room. The split reached its peak. The ceiling cracked, and through the fissure, Elias didn't see the sky. He saw a kaleidoscope of 1,000 different versions of his own life. Elias the astronaut, looking down at a blue marble. Elias the baker, smelling of yeast and sugar. Elias the ghost, wandering an empty city. The split of reality wasn't a tragedy. It was an audition. The universe was asking him who he wanted to be before the curtain closed. The final step. Elias looked at the alternate Elias one last time. The man in the uniform shook his head, a silent warning. Maybe the desert side wasn't the paradise it seemed. Maybe the alive Sarah there wasn't the woman he loved, but a stranger with her face. He looked at his broken phone on the oak floor. Sarah's voice was still faint, calling his name from some distant, stable shore. "I'm coming," he whispered. He didn't step left, and he didn't step right. Elias did the one thing the scientists said was impossible. He walked directly into the seam. He didn't choose a side. He chose the bridge. The world exploded into white noise. The whistle of the tea kettle reached a crescendo, a single, pure note that contained every sound ever made. Elias felt himself stretch, his atoms pulled into long ribbons of light, weaving through the crimson room, the mossy kitchen, and the amber desert. The aftermath. When the light faded, the kitchen was silent, the stove was off, the kettle was cold, the floor was solid, gray slate, neither oak nor moss. The walls were a soft, neutral blue. Elias sat on the floor, gasping for air. He touched the ground. It was firm. He looked at his hands. They were solid. He stood up shakily and walked to the window. Outside, there was no rain, and there was no desert. Instead, the sky was a deep twilight indigo, filled with stars that didn't twinkle. People walked the streets below, their bodies shimmering slightly, as if they were made of fine glass. He went to the door and opened it. Standing in the hallway was Sarah. She wasn't holding a phone. She was holding a box of books, looking at him with an expression of confused recognition. "Elias?" she asked. "Did you feel that?" "The split?" he asked. She nodded, setting the box down. "It's over. The reality's fused. This is what's left." He looked past her, seeing the way the hallway seemed to stretch into impossible geometries. Beautiful and new. They weren't in his world, or her world, or the desert world. They were in the synthesis. The split had ended, not by choosing one reality over another, but by forging a new one from the shards of the old. It was a homecoming. High above the fractal architecture of the new city, in a spire that seemed to be woven from solidified moonlight and data streams, sat the figure the survivors had begun to call the Archivist. He did not have a name, not anymore. Names were anchors for those who intended to stay in one place, one time, and one body. He had long ago discarded such heavy things. He was the immortal observer, the singular consciousness that had peered through the split since the first atom was smashed in Svalbard, watching the many worlds theory transition from a mathematical headache into a physical catastrophe. The view from the outside. The Archivist sat in a chair that didn't touch the floor. Around him, the walls of the spire weren't made of stone or glass, but of event horizons, thin, transparent membranes that displayed different moments in history simultaneously. To his left, he saw the building of the Great Pyramids, the workers looking like golden ants under a sun that burned with a pre-industrial purity. To his right, he saw the heat death of a distant galaxy, stars blinking out like tired eyes closing for a long sleep. In front of him, he saw Elias and Sarah standing in their new hallway, their hands touching, their bodies humming with the static of the fusion. "How fragile," the Archivist murmured. His voice didn't vibrate in the air. It resonated directly in the consciousness of the room. They think they have found a home. They do not realize they are merely the grout between the bricks of a collapsing house. The Archivist was not a god, though the primitive survivors in the lower sectors offered him prayers of carbon-scented smoke. He was a man. Once. He had been the lead technician at the Svalbard Array, the one who had pushed the initialize sequence when the warnings were screaming in red light. When the split occurred, he hadn't been pushed into one reality or another. He had been caught in the null zone, the vacuum between dimensions. The vacuum had hollowed him out. It had stripped away his hunger, his aging, and his ego, replacing them with a terrifying, panoramic clarity. He was immortal, not because he could live forever, but because time no longer had a direction for him. He was a needle stuck in the groove of a spinning record, hearing every note at once. The weight of observation. Being the immortal observer was a burden of infinite boredom, punctuated by flashes of exquisite agony. He watched a version of the French Revolution where the guillotines were made of light. He watched a version of the 1960s where the moon landing was filmed on a stage, and another where the moon actually swallowed the earth. He saw the trillions of ways humanity had tried to love, kill, and understand itself. But his focus kept returning to the synthesis, this specific, jagged moment where the realities had fused into a messy, unstable compromise. The Archivist stood, his robes, a weave of light and shadow, flowing behind him. He walked toward the membrane showing Elias and Sarah. He pressed a long, translucent finger against the image of Elias's chest. "You chose the bridge," the Archivist whispered. "A bold move. Most choose the comfort of a familiar lie. You chose the discomfort of an impossible truth." The Archivist knew what Elias did not. The synthesis was decaying. Like a graft that the body rejects, the different realities were starting to fester at the seams. The blue-walled kitchen Elias now stood in was drawing power from a reality where the sun was going supernova. The air they breathed was being recycled from a prehistoric jungle. It was a beautiful, doomed mosaic. The visitation, the Archivist decided it was time to intervene. He rarely did. Usually he preferred to let the entropy run its course. But Elias was a statistical anomaly. He had navigated the split with a conscious intent that the Archivist hadn't seen in 10,000 simulated lifetimes. He closed his eyes and stepped sideways. In the blue-walled hallway, Elias felt a sudden drop in temperature. The static in his skin flared, turning from a dull hum to a sharp sting. Sarah gasped, her hand slipping from his as a figure coalesced in the space between them. The Archivist appeared not as a man, but as a silhouette of stars. His presence pushed the walls of the hallway outward, stretching the space into an infinite corridor. "Who are you?" Elias demanded, stepping in front of Sarah. His voice sounded small in the presence of the observer. "I am the one who watched you choose," the Archivist said. He didn't move his mouth, yet the words echoed in Elias's marrow. "I am the ghost of the mistake that made this world." "The Svalbard Array," Sarah whispered, her eyes wide. You're the technician, Dr. Aris Thorne. You disappeared during the first lapse." The silhouette flickered. "Thorne is a shadow on a wall. I am the observer, and I have come to tell you that your home is a graveyard. The terms of reality." The Archivist waved a hand, and the walls of the apartment became transparent. Beyond them, Elias saw the Indigo City, but now he saw the cracks. He saw a skyscraper flickering into a giant redwood tree and back again. He saw the sky ripple like water, revealing a void of absolute blackness behind the stars. "The synthesis is a temporary stabilization," the Archivist explained. The realities you fused are incompatible. Within 72 hours, the pressure of the unbin will crush this world into a singularity. You haven't saved yourselves. You've just gathered all the victims into one room. Elias felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. There has to be a way to fix it. If I could walk into the seam once, I can do it again. Into what? The Archivist countered. There are no more seams. You have used the last of the universe's flexibility. To fix this, you would need to go back to the source. You would need to prevent the split from ever happening. Then send us back, Sarah said, her voice trembling but firm. The Archivist let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. I cannot go back. I am part of the architecture now. If I move, the whole structure collapses. I am the pillar holding up a falling sky. He turned his star-filled gaze toward Elias. But you are still tethered. You have the static in you. You could survive the journey back through the friction of time. But there is a price, the price of permanence. The Archivist leaned in, his face a swirling nebula of light. To save the world, you must erase the synthesis. You must return to the moment of the first lapse and stop the array. But if you do, this reality, this version of you and Sarah, this moment of reconciliation, will never have existed. You will return to the split, to the divorce, to the loneliness. You will save the billions, but you will lose the us you just found. Aris looked at Sarah. She looked back at him, her face pale in the light of the immortal observer. They had just found each other across the wreckage of 1,000 worlds. Now, they were being asked to become strangers again to save a world that didn't even know it was broken. And you, Elias asked the Archivist, what happens to you if I succeed? I will cease to be, the Archivist said, and for the first time there was a hint of emotion in his voice. Longing. I will become Aris Thorne again. I will grow old. I will forget the stars. I will be allowed to die. The Archivist stepped back, the hallway beginning to reform around them. The indigo city returned, flickering slightly. The choice is yours, Elias. You can live these last 3 days in the warmth of a dying sun, or you can step into the fire and give the world its tomorrow back. The immortal observer began to fade, his starlight dimming as he retreated back to his spire. I will be watching, his voice echoed, faint as a memory. I am always watching. Elias and Sarah stood in the silence of their blue kitchen. The tea kettle sat on the stove, a silent witness. We have to do it, don't we? Sarah asked softly. Elias didn't answer immediately. He looked at his hand, still humming with the power of 1,000 realities. He looked at Sarah, the only thing that felt real in a universe of ghosts. We have 72 hours, he said. Let's make them last a lifetime. The countdown didn't appear as a digital clock in the sky, though in some of the more unstable sectors of the Indigo City, people claimed they could hear a steady, rhythmic thrumming beneath the pavement, the heartbeat of a dying universe. For Elias, the 72 hours felt less like a span of time and more like a physical thinning of the world. Objects were losing their weight. When he picked up a glass of water, it felt as light as a thought. When he spoke, his words seemed to hang in the air. decided to leave the blue-walled apartment. It was no longer safe. The kitchen floor had begun to transparentize, revealing a terrifying view of a Carboniferous-era swamp teeming with giant insects 10 stories below. They stepped out into the street, and the world greeted them with a kaleidoscopic assault. The Indigo City was now a patchwork quilt of every what-if in human history. They walked past a Victorian-era library that was slowly being overwritten by a futuristic laboratory of chrome and pulsing neon. On the street corner, a holographic advertisement for a brand of synthetic oxygen flickered over a stone fountain where a woman in a Roman stola was washing clothes in water that glowed like liquid mercury. "Don't look too long," Elias warned, gripping Sarah's hand. "If you try to make sense of it all, your brain tries to wire itself to every timeline at once. That's how people go static." They had seen the static sufferers in the park, people who had stared too long at the overlapping realities and simply stopped. They stood frozen, their bodies vibrating with a high-frequency blur, caught in a mental feedback loop as they tried to process an infinite number of simultaneous presents. The physics of memory. As they navigated the shifting streets toward the city's transit hub, which now resembled a cathedral made of glass and gears, Elias felt his own memories beginning to smear. He remembered the divorce. He remembered the cold silence of the apartment and the taste of cheap whiskey. But layered directly on top of that was a memory of a golden afternoon on a beach that never existed, where he and Sarah had celebrated their 10th anniversary. Both memories felt equally real. Both had the same emotional weight, the same sensory detail. "Sarah," he whispered, stopping near a wall that was half brick, half circuitry. "Do you remember the car accident? The one from the other side of the split?" Sarah looked at the train station yesterday. The train station yesterday. And I remember a life where we never met at all. I remember being a painter in Paris." She touched her temple. "It's like my head is a radio caught between stations. I can hear all the music, but I can't find the melody." This was the subjective horizon. The collapse of the external world was forcing the internal world to expand. Without a stable now to tether them, the human consciousness was beginning to bleed into the collective possibilities of the multiverse. The Archivist's echo. The air suddenly shimmered, and for a brief moment the immortal observer appeared, not as the grand celestial entity they had met in the spire, but as a flickering, translucent man in a lab coat. He was figure vanished, replaced by a gust of wind that smelled of ancient pine needles. "He's losing his grip," Elias realized. "The Archivist is the anchor, but the anchor is dragging. If he dissolves completely before we reach the array point, there won't be a past to go back to. It'll just be an endless white void. The bridge to nowhere." They reached the center of the city, where the Great Tear had first manifested. In the synthesis, this was the anchor point, a massive spire of twisted metal and glowing energy that reached toward the zenith of the indigo sky. It was the physical manifestation of the Svalbard Array's mistake, a wound that refused to scab over. The closer they got, the more the subjective horizon distorted their perceptions. The ground felt like it was sloping upward at a 45-degree angle, even though it looked flat. The sun, or the three suns that were currently visible, seemed to be spinning in a slow, clockwise circle. "We have to climb it," Elias said, looking at the spire. The Archivist said, "The static in my blood is the key. If I can get to the core of the anchor, I can use the decay of the synthesis to slingshot back to the original lapse." "And then?" Sarah asked. Her voice was becoming translucent, like the rest of the world. "And then I stop Aris Thorne. I pull the plug before the Higgs field is destabilized." They stood at the base of the spire. Around them, the city was beginning to dissolve into literal static, white and black pixels raining from the sky like snow. People were vanishing, not by dying, but by simply ceasing to be observed by a stable reality. The final horizon. Elias turned to Sarah. This was the moment the subjective horizon became absolute. In a few minutes, the distance between them would become infinite. If he succeeded, the man standing here would never have existed. The woman standing here would return to whatever timeline the true reality dictated. Perhaps the one where she died. Perhaps the one where they were strangers. "In every world," Elias said, his voice thick with the weight of 1,000,000,000 lives, "I find you. Even when the stars were falling and the floors were turning to moss, I found you." Sarah smiled, and for a second the flickering of her form stabilized. "Then find me again, in the real world, the one that doesn't scream." Elias stepped into the base of the spire. The energy there was a roar of pure information. It felt like walking into a hurricane of books, every page a different life. He felt his subjective self, his name, his age, his fears, being stripped away. He was becoming a mathematical point, a vector of intent aimed at a single moment in the past. He looked back one last time. Sarah was a silhouette against the white static of the world's end. She raised a hand, a gesture of goodbye that echoed across every version of reality. Then the subjective horizon crossed over. The I became we, and the we became everything. The slingshot Elias was no longer walking. He was falling upward through the throat of the universe. He saw the synthesis contract behind him, a tiny flickering spark of blue and indigo in an ocean of darkness. He saw the split the moment the tea kettle whistled in 2 rooms at once. He saw the Svalbard Array, a cold metallic ring buried deep in the ice of the north. He was the arrow. The Archivist was the bow. And the target was a single red initialize button on a console 3 years in the past. The friction was unbearable. The heat of 1,000,000,000 what-ifs burned against his skin. He felt his memories of Sarah being scorched away, the golden beach and the blue kitchen turning to ash in the face of the overwhelming is. But he held on to one thought, a single grain of subjective truth in an objective void. Turn it off. The ascent was not a climb. It was a shedding. As Elias hurtled toward the chronological origin of the disaster, the perspective shifted. We no longer see through the eyes of the man with the static in his blood. Instead, we return to the spire, to the silent, cold height of the Archivist. To be immortal in a collapsing multiverse is not to live forever. It is to be the only person in a room while the walls turn into ghosts. For Aris Thorne, the man who became the immortal observer, loneliness was not an emotion. It was a physical constant, as fundamental as gravity or the weak nuclear force. The prison of perspective. The Archivist sat in his suspended chair, watching the slingshot of Elias's consciousness. To Elias, the journey was a frantic, burning blur of seconds. To the Archivist, it was a slow, agonizingly detailed ballet that he had seen 1,000 times in 1,000 different permutations. The tragedy of the Archivist's immortality lay in the loss of the surprise. When you can see the subjective horizon of every soul in existence, you no longer hear conversations, you hear scripts. He knew that in 7 seconds, the woman in the Roman stola in the courtyard below would vanish because the reality providing her oxygen would flicker out. He knew that the Victorian library would finally be consumed by the neon lab at exactly 4:12 p.m. synthesis time. He watched Elias, a tiny, defiant spark, fighting the friction of the unbin. "Go on," the Archivist whispered to the empty, shimmering air. "Break the glass. Let me fall back into the dirt." He reached out a hand, and the air in front of him solidified into a playback of his own origin, the day at the Svalbard Array. He saw himself, younger, with eyes that still held the spark of scientific arrogance. He saw his hands hovering over the terminal. In that moment, 3 years ago, Aris Thorne had felt like a pioneer. He thought he was unlocking the secrets of the vacuum, finding... into flickering pixels of probability. He looked at the event horizon membrane displaying Sarah. She was standing at the base of the anchor, her hand still raised in that heartbreaking goodbye. "She is a masterpiece of 1,000,000,000 coincidences," the Archivist noted. He felt a phantom ache in a heart that no longer beat. In his youth, he had a Sarah too. Not this Sarah, but a woman named Elena who had died in the very first microsecond of the split. The 0 point of the disaster. His immortality was built on the foundation of her non-existence. To keep the multiverse from collapsing instantly, the array had channeled the excess energy of the Higgs destabilization through the nearest sentient conductor, Aris Thorne. It had used his life as a stabilizer, burning away his humanity, to create a central processor for the chaos. He had spent 3 years, though years meant nothing to him, watching every version of Elena die. He had seen her vanish in fire, in ice, in static, and in silence. He had become an expert in the geometry of her grief, the weight of the before. The Archivist stood up. The spire groaned, the lunar weave walls thinning until he could see the raw, black void of the null zone outside. The synthesis was losing its grip on the indigo city. He walked to the center of the room, where a single, glowing orb of light hovered. This was the core of the anchor, the link between the synthesis and the Svalbard Array in the past. It was the bow he was using to shoot Elias back through time. Every inch Elias moved toward the past, the Archivist felt a corresponding loss of his own power. His starlight robes were becoming gray wool. His nebula-filled eyes were clearing, revealing the tired, bloodshot pupils of a man who hadn't slept in centuries. "The loneliness is ending," he told the void. But with the end of loneliness came the return of linear fear. For the first time in 3 years, the Archivist didn't know what would happen next. If Elias succeeded, Aris Thorne would be back in Svalbard. He would be a man again. He would have to face the consequences of his ambition. Would he have the strength to let the experiment fail? Or would the cycle begin again, a temporal Ouroboros devouring its own tail? The final observation. The Archivist leaned against the core. He could feel Elias now, almost at the target. The friction of the slingshot was tearing at the spire. Below, the indigo city was a sea of white noise. The Roman laundress, the Victorian library, the violet moss, all of it was being sucked into the vacuum of the impending reset. He looked at the very last event horizon membrane. It showed the Svalbard Array 3 years ago. The room was cold, filled with the hum of liquid nitrogen and the clicking of high-speed cameras. He saw himself, the young Thorne, reaching for the initialize button. And then he saw the static. A blur of light was coalescing in the center of the array room. It was Elias. He looked like a man made of lightning, his skin peeling back to reveal the raw energy of the synthesis. The immortal observer watched his younger self freeze. He watched the young Thorne look at the specter of Elias with a mixture of terror and wonder. "Stop," the Archivist whispered, though his voice couldn't travel across the 3-year gap. "Listen to the ghost. Don't be the observer. Be the man." The dissolution, the spire began to crumble. The moonweave turned to dust, falling into the blackness of the null zone. The Archivist felt his legs give way. He was no longer floating, he was falling. The gravity of a single coherent timeline was finally reclaiming him. He looked down at his hands. They were solid, they were wrinkled, they were shaking. The silence of immortality was being replaced by the cacophony of the before. He could hear the wind of Svalbard howling against the reinforced steel of the lab. He could smell the ozone and the bitter coffee. The loneliness was gone, replaced by the crushing weight of accountability. "I am coming back," Aris Thorne said, his voice now purely human, cracking with the realization of what he had done. As the synthesis winked out, as the indigo city, Sarah's goodbye, and the blue-walled kitchen vanished into the unbin, the Archivist closed his eyes. He wasn't a god anymore. He wasn't an observer. He was just a man in a cold room, waiting for a stranger from a future that shouldn't exist to tell him to stop. Nudity, terminal point. The transition was a violent snap. The starlight died. The silence broke. Aris Thorne opened his eyes. He was standing in the Svalbard Array. His hand was an inch away from the initialize button. The red light of the warning system was reflected in his safety goggles. Across the room, the air screamed. A rift of static tore open, and a man stumbled out, burnt, glowing, and smelling of 1,000 different worlds. The Archivist was dead. The man was back, and the loneliness of immortality was about to be replaced by the chaos of the second chance. The air in the Svalbard Hadron Array didn't just vibrate. It screamed with the structural agony of 1,000 rejected futures. Elias hit the concrete floor of the laboratory with the weight of a dying star. His arrival was not a graceful descent. It was a spatial rupture. Around him, the high-tech sanctuary of 2023, a world of gleaming liquid nitrogen pipes, humming servers, and the sterile scent of ozone, warped like a reflection in a disturbed pond. For a fleeting second, the lab was both a pristine facility and a rusted ruin overgrown with violet moss. Standing 10 feet away, his hand hovering over the initialized sequence, was the young Dr. Aris Thorne. He was a man of flesh and blood, devoid of the starlight robes and the nebula eyes of the Archivist. To this version of Aris, the world was still sane. The Higgs field was a mathematical target, not a weapon. "Step back," Elias wheezed. The static in his lungs made every breath feel like inhaling broken glass. The convergence of two ghosts. Aris Thorne didn't move. His face was a mask of pure academic shock. He looked at Elias, a man wearing the scorched rags of a future that shouldn't exist, skin flickering with the translucent blue light of the synthesis. "What are you?" Aris whispered. His voice was steady, the voice of a man who believed every anomaly had a variable that could be solved. A projection? A quantum hallucination? "I am the consequence," Elias said, forcing himself to his feet. Every movement felt like dragging his soul through a sieve. The closer he got to Aris, the more the room began to lapse. The coffee mug on Aris's desk transformed into a skull, then a handful of sand, then back into a mug. "You're about to trigger the split," Elias continued, his voice echoing with the phantom layers of the Sarah he had left behind. "You think you're stabilizing the vacuum. You're not. You're unmaking the glue of the universe. In 3 years, the sky will turn indigo, and the woman you love will be a memory in a graveyard of worlds." Aris flinched at the mention of the woman, Elena. She was in the observation booth, her hand pressed against the reinforced glass, watching the man she loved prepare to change history. "The math is perfect," Aris insisted, though his hand trembled. "The Higgs stability curve is within the 3 sigma deviation. This experiment will provide infinite energy. It will save the world from the climate collapse." "It will save the world by deleting it," Elias countered. He reached out, and as his fingers brushed the console, a holographic surge erupted. It wasn't a projection from the lab. It was a leak from the synthesis. Images of the Indigo City, the Roman laundress, and the crumbling spire flooded the room. The last observation. The young Aris Thorne watched the images with a terrifying hunger. He saw the immortal observer he was destined to become. He saw the loneliness. He saw the white static raining from the sky. "Is that me?" Aris asked, pointing to the silhouette of stars that had been his future self. "That is what's left when you remove the man from the observer," Elias said. "He sent me here to kill him. He sent me here to kill you." The sirens in the lab reached a crescendo. The countdown on the main monitor hit 0010. The magnets in the ring beneath them were spinning at 99.99%, the speed of light. The vacuum was beginning to boil. "If I stop it now," Aris said, his eyes darting to the observation booth where Elena stood, "the project is defunded. We lose everything. We go back to being nobodies in a dying world." "If you don't stop it," Elias roared, "you lose her, not just to death, but to non-existence. You will spend eternity watching her die in a million different ways, and you won't even be able to scream." The hand of fate 0005. The room began to dissolve. The subjective horizon was closing in. The walls of the Svalbard Array were turning into ribbons of light. Elias felt himself fading. He was a creature of the synthesis, and the synthesis was being erased by his very presence in the past. He looked at his hands. They were becoming transparent. He could see the floor through his palms. "Sarah," he whispered. The memory of her was the only thing keeping his molecules together. He remembered the smell of her hair, the way she looked in the blue kitchen, the way she had said, "Find me again." 0003. Aris Thorne looked at the button. Then he looked at Elena. She couldn't hear their conversation through the soundproof glass, but she saw the terror on Aris's face. She tapped on the glass and blew him a kiss, a simple, mundane gesture of love that carried more weight than 1,000,000,000,000 galaxies. In that moment, the Archivist's loneliness reached across time and touched the young man's heart. Aris realized that the infinite knowledge of the observer was a portrait for a single, finite afternoon with a woman who loved him. 0002. Aris didn't press initialize. He smashed his fist into the emergency abort lever. The great collapse. The sound was not an explosion. It was the sound of 1,000,000,000 doors slamming shut at once. The magnets groaned and seized. The liquid nitrogen vented in a massive, freezing cloud that obscured everything. The vacuum pressure equalized with a thud that knocked Aris to the floor. Elias felt the slingshot snap. Without the split to sustain him, he was being pulled into the void. The synthesis, the indigo city, the violet moss, the desert suns, was being overwritten by the real timeline. It was like a painting being washed away by a torrential rain. "Elias!" Aris shouted, crawling through the mist. "What happens now?" But Elias couldn't answer. He was no longer a man. He was a ghost of a timeline that never happened. He saw the lab stabilize. He saw the red lights turn to green. He saw Elena run out of the observation booth and throw her arms around Aris. They were safe. The world was gray, rainy, and broken. But it was solid. As Elias dissolved into the last of the static, he felt a sudden, sharp pull. The Archivist had said he was tethered. He wasn't being erased. He was being relocated. The universe, in its infinite and cold accounting, was returning the stowaway to his proper coordinates. The new morning Elias opened his eyes. He was lying on a floor. It wasn't oak, and it wasn't moss. It was cheap, beige carpet. The air didn't smell like ozone or cinnamon. It smelled like rain and burnt toast. He sat up, his head throbbing. He was in an apartment, a small, messy one-bedroom in Seattle. There were no lapses. The coffee cup on the table was just a coffee cup. The window showed a gray, drizzly sky and a street full of cars moving forward in time. He scrambled to his feet, checking his hands. They were solid, no blue light, no static. He looked at the calendar on the wall. March 3rd, 2026, the date of the ultimate reset. In the other life, this was the day the world ended. In this life, it was just a Tuesday. He grabbed his phone. His hands shook so hard he almost dropped it. He scrolled through his contacts. He didn't expect to find it. He expected a blank space where a life used to be. Sarah, he hit call. The phone rang, once, twice, 3 times. Each ring felt like a century. "Hello?" The voice was clear. It wasn't tinny. It wasn't layered. It was her. "Sarah?" Elias asked, his voice breaking. Elias, why are you calling so early? I thought we weren't talking until the mediation on Friday. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his face. In this world, they were still divorced. The synthesis hadn't brought them back together. There was no Indigo City to force a reconciliation, but she was alive. She was real, and she was only a few miles away. Elias started, looking out at the mundane, beautiful gray world. I just wanted to see if you wanted to get coffee, not to talk about the papers, just coffee. In the rain, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. Elias held his breath, standing on the edge of the ultimate reset. The world didn't need a hero anymore. It just needed a man who was willing to try again. Coffee, Sarah said, and he could hear the faint hint of a smile in her voice, a sound more powerful than any Higgs field. Yeah, Elias, I'd like that. The observer's end, deep in the archives of the Svalbard facility, in a folder that would never be opened. A single sensor log recorded an impossible event. For 1 nanosecond on a Tuesday in 2023, the vacuum had fluctuated. A ghost had appeared. A man had chosen love over power, and the universe had reset its clock. The immortal observer was gone. The split was healed. And for Elias, the real work, the human work, was finally beginning.